Japan's defeat in the Greater East Asia War was an unprecedented national catastrophe in the country's more than 2,000 years of history. The homeland was occupied by foreign troops, and Japan lost both its sovereignty and its diplomatic authority. From that point, the Allied forces, led mainly by the United States, began rebuilding Japan from the ground up. In August 1945, the General Headquarters of the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, GHQ, with Douglas MacArthur as Supreme Commander, was established in Tokyo. Although it was nominally an Allied occupation, in practice it was almost entirely carried out by the U.S. military. One of GHQ's occupation policies was the War Guilt Information Program. The term itself came from literary critic Jun Ito, who used it in a magazine series. The program aimed to thoroughly instill in the Japanese public the idea of their collective responsibility for the war and to embed a sense of guilt. Press codes were imposed on media outlets, and newspapers and publishers were harshly punished for violations. More than 7,000 pre-war books were banned and burned, with the University of Tokyo's Faculty of Letters, acting under government request, playing a major role. Censorship involved roughly 4,000 Japanese collaborators and extended even to private letters and phone conversations. Although Article 10 of the Potsdam Declaration stated that freedom of speech, religion, and thought, as well as fundamental human rights, shall be established, the Japanese people had no means to resist GHQ's violations of these principles. GHQ's primary goal was to remake Japan into a nation that would never again challenge the United States. To achieve this, GHQ ordered the Japanese government to revise the Meiji Constitution and draft a new one. The cabinet under Prime Minister Shidehara Kujuro produced a draft, but when MacArthur saw that it still granted governing authority to the emperor, he ordered GHQ's government section to draft its own version. 25 members of the government section, following the policies of the Truman administration, completed their draft in just 9 days. Japan had no choice but to accept GHQ's draft. Rejecting it risked attempts to pursue the emperor's war responsibility. Even so, after negotiations, a few modest revisions were made, and the Constitution of Japan was promulgated on October 3, 1946. Remarkably, Japan has never amended this constitution, not once, up to the present day. Alongside the new constitution, GHQ ordered the Japanese cabinet to carry out 5 major reforms. 1. Women's political participation. Men and women aged 20 and over were granted the right to vote, and the first post-war election produced 39 Japan's first female lawmakers. 2. Strengthening labor rights. Worker protections were expanded to prevent exploitation. 3. Educational liberalization. State-issued textbooks were abolished, and education was democratized. 4. Abolition of pre-war thought control institutions. Secret police and systems related to ideological repression were dismantled. 5. Economic democratization. Zaibatsu conglomerates were broken up. Once markets were freed from monopoly control, many new companies emerged. Sony and Honda grew rapidly during this period. Agrarian land reform, something pre-war Japan had attempted but never achieved, was also carried out. But because Japan already had relatively few large landowners, the reform ended up fragmenting farmland too much and is often cited as one reason for the decline of modern Japanese agriculture. Though these reforms had negative side effects, measures like Zaibatsu dissolution and land reform were bold moves that only GHQ could have implemented. Compared to pre-war Japan, society undeniably became more egalitarian and competitive. The Kazoku, a hereditary peerage made up of former court nobles, daimyo families, and contributors to the Meiji Restoration, was abolished by GHQ. Despite their many privileges, Kazoku members were celebrity-like figures to ordinary people. Magazines frequently featured their wives, and scandals involving affairs, elopements, or double suicides filled newspapers. The imperial household was also drastically reduced. Of the 14 imperial branches, 11 were abolished. Because many of the former branches were male-line descendants, modern Japan faces ongoing debates about revising the imperial household law to preserve the unbroken imperial line. One of GHQ's most consequential actions was the purge of teachers, public officials, and intellectuals. Many patriotic figures and critics of the occupation were removed from public life. Some figures who avoided being purged chose to adapt quickly to the new order under GHQ. Leaders such as Shigeru Yoshida aligned closely with the occupation authorities, while scholars and politicians reshaped their views to fit the new democratic framework. But these purges eventually backfired. As socialists and communists gained influence in media and education, labor unions grew stronger, and violent labor disputes erupted nationwide. In 1949, the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, defeated Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government on the Asian continent and established a communist state. Fearing that Japan might follow the same path, GHQ signaled in 1950 that it would move toward the illegalization of the Japanese Communist Party. It urged the removal of communists and their sympathizers from government offices, major corporations, and educational institutions. But the purge was not as thorough as it had once been. As a result, the Japanese Communist Party continues to exist as a legal political party in Japan today. GHQ divided war crime charges into 3 categories: A, B, and C. 29 Class A suspects were indicted on April 29, 1946, the Emperor's birthday. At the Tokyo trial, which began May 3rd, Indian judge Radha Binod Paul, an expert in international law, argued that prosecuting defendants under ex post facto laws created by the victors violated international law, and he insisted all defendants were innocent. Nonetheless, 7 of the 28 defendants were sentenced to death and executed on December 23, 1948, the birthday of the current Emperor Emeritus. Many Japanese soldiers who remained in Southeast Asia were never formally charged, yet died under torture, abuse, or suicide. Meanwhile, in the chaos at war's end, the Soviet Union attacked and illegally occupied southern Karafuto, the Chieshima Islands, and what is now the Northern Territories. Countless Japanese in these regions and in Manchuria and China were captured and forced into labor by Soviet forces. An opera house built by some of these Japanese forced laborers still stands in Uzbekistan today. Under the occupation, large numbers of Japanese civilians were said to have been killed or raped by American soldiers, but the Japanese police were forbidden from investigating or arresting U.S. personnel, so the exact numbers remain unknown. Some Koreans already residing in Japan before the war committed crimes such as murder, robbery, and rape, and seized prime land near stations or in burned-out districts. Criticism of Koreans was prohibited by the press code, and the situation worsened. In response, certain Yakuza groups organized vigilante units and fought against violent offenders, earning the gratitude of many Japanese at the time. As the situation escalated to the point where even police officers were being killed, Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru wrote to MacArthur requesting that all Koreans in Japan be repatriated at Japan's expense. The request was never carried out, but GHQ did order the dissolution of the League of Koreans in Japan as a violent organization. The group later reformed as the General Association of Korean Residents in Japan, Chongryon, which remains active today and is monitored by Japan's public security authorities for its close ties to North Korea. In October 1945, the United Nations was founded, and war was declared illegal under its charter. Many hoped this would usher in peace, but the Cold War had already begun, pitting the US, UK, and France-led liberal bloc against the Soviet and China-led communist bloc. The Korean peninsula was divided at the 38th parallel. The Soviets occupied the north and the Americans the south, forming North Korea and South Korea. In June 1950, North Korea, supported by the Soviets, invaded the South, igniting the Korean War. Because U.S. forces stationed in Japan were deployed to Korea, the U.S. required Japan to establish a new domestic security force, the National Police Reserve, the forerunner of today's self-defense forces. Japan also supplied military materials for U.S. operations in Korea, which sparked a rapid economic recovery. During this time, the U.S. decided to accelerate Japan's independence and bring it firmly into the liberal bloc. In September 1951, Japan signed the San Francisco Peace Treaty with 48 nations, and Japan regained its sovereignty 7 years after the war. Japan renounced its claims to southern Karafuto and the Chieshima Islands in the treaty, but the Soviet Union refused to sign, arguing the conference was invalid because the People's Republic of China, a fellow communist state, was not invited. As a result, the territories remain of undetermined sovereignty. Japan simultaneously signed the Japan-U.S. Security Treaty, allowing U.S. bases to remain across the country, while Okinawa, the Amami Islands, and the Ogasawara Islands stayed under U.S. control. From around 1958, Prime Minister Kishi Nobusuke sought to revise the Security Treaty to create a more equal Japan-U.S. relationship. Left-wing parties, especially the Japanese Communist Party, opposed the revision, arguing it would entangle Japan in American wars. Mass protests involving labor unions and student groups surrounded the Diet Building. Even so, the treaty passed by forced vote in May 1960 and took effect in June, after which the Kishi cabinet resigned to avoid further turmoil. As soldiers returned home all at once right after the war, the population surged, which worsened the already severe shortage of goods. Many ordinary people starved to death. In these conditions, black markets, mostly controlled by Yakuza, rapidly expanded in urban areas. Prices there were 5 to 10 times higher than the official rates, but because essential goods could be bought only on the black market, it became a lifeline for many. Although Japan had become one of the poorest countries in the world after the war, it managed to rebuild itself with astonishing speed through international support from the US, the World Bank, and others. Akira Kurosawa's film Rashomon won the Golden Lion at the 1951 Venice Film Festival and received an honorary Academy Award the following year. His 1954 film, Seven Samurai, became one of the most renowned Japanese films ever made. To address food shortages, the Japanese government promoted meals using surplus American wheat. Momofuku Ando, who later created cup noodles, used this wheat to develop noodles suited to Japanese taste, launching the world's first instant ramen in 1958, a product that became a national staple. Just 19 years after the war, Tokyo hosted the 1964 Olympics. The city, once devastated by air raids, had transformed with Tokyo Tower, modern buildings, and new infrastructure. Bullet train, expressways were built, and by 1968, Japan had become the world's second-largest economy. However, rapid growth also produced health damage from industrial pollution. Urbanization brought problems with exhaust fumes, waste disposal, and other environmental issues. Meanwhile, student movements spread nationwide. University students participated in anti-Vietnam War demonstrations and protests against the docking of U.S. aircraft carriers, eventually directing their anger toward university governance itself. Although many citizens initially sympathized, escalating infighting and militant tactics eroded public support, and by 1970 the student movement had largely died down. Its splinter groups, however, radicalized into far-left militant organizations and carried out various acts of terrorism. The Japanese Red Army, which advocated global simultaneous revolution, hijacked Japan Airlines flights and carried out notorious terrorist attacks abroad, accepting civilian casualties as necessary. The group's leader, long a fugitive, was arrested in 2000 and announced the organization's dissolution in 2001, though 7 members remain on wanted lists today. In May 1972, Okinawa was finally returned to Japan after behind-the-scenes negotiations by Prime Minister Sato Eisaku. A key figure behind this was Sato's older brother, former Prime Minister Kishi Nobusuke. Kishi was also the grandfather of former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, the longest-serving premier in Japanese constitutional history. In October 1973, the Yom Kippur War triggered a spike in oil prices, plunging Japan into chaos. This marked the end of Japan's high-growth era. Afterward, Japan focused on extreme energy efficiency and cost-cutting, producing a wave of high-quality, low-cost products. As color TVs became common in ordinary households, Nintendo released the Famicom in 1983, sparking the rapid growth of Japan's gaming culture. On September 27, 1945, Emperor Showa visited the U.S. Embassy and said to MacArthur, "I have come to offer myself to the judgment of the nations you represent, taking upon myself full responsibility for every political and military decision and action taken during the war." He also asked that, above all, the Japanese people not be left to suffer, and requested the Allies' assistance. MacArthur, assuming the emperor had come to beg for his life, later wrote, "This courageous attitude, willing to take upon himself responsibility so great as to involve death, responsibility that in light of all the facts known to me clearly should not rest upon him, shook me to my core. At that moment I realized that the man before me was, in his personal character, the finest gentleman Japan could offer." As MacArthur noted, Emperor Showa had been a constitutional monarch, not an autocrat. Throughout his life, he made political decisions only twice: during the February 26th incident to suppress the rebellion, and at the end of the Greater East Asia War to bring about peace. During the firebombing of Tokyo, when urged to evacuate, he refused, saying he could not flee while his subjects were dying before his eyes. From that moment, he was prepared for death. From 1946 onward, he traveled nationwide for 8.5 years to encourage the wounded and devastated population. In 1987, a visit to Okinawa, returned from the U.S. years earlier, was scheduled, but he fell ill. On January 7, 1989, Emperor Showa passed away after a long struggle with illness, bringing the Showa era to an end.